Lunch and Learn. If you're new, welcome. For a bit of context, I'm Hannah. I'm from Sisu Therapies, and Lunch and Learn is our free monthly PD that we put on for everybody. And we try and make the content accessible no matter who you are. So whether you're a parent or teacher or therapist, our goal is that these are free learning that everyone can access. And today is definitely one of those. It's something relevant to all of us, and that is the teenage brain. And if you've ever heard me ramble before, you know that I absolutely love the brain, despite the fact that I absolutely hated neuroanatomy when I was becoming an OT. But since then, I've learned how important it is that we understand what's going on for ourselves. And that is definitely the case with teenagers. Now, usually I have the really wonderful Megan helping me with all things techie, even though I've done this 100 times. But it's just me flying solo today, so I hope you'll oh, there we go, first hiccup. Hope you'll grant me a little bit of grace. And that's the other thing I would like you to take away from today is that everybody's doing their best. So teenagers, parents, teachers, it's a tricky time. So I think there's, two things at least there. The brain is going through lots of changes, and so there's lots of hiccups, and everyone is doing their best. So with that, I'm going to attempt to share my screen, and we will see how it goes. It's always really fun. Oh, good, it went on. Oh, I did actually have to do this a couple of times because I couldn't work it out. This is why we rely on others. Everyone has their own expertise. Mine is not tech. I used to be quite techy, but not anymore. Anyway, let's kick it off. The adolescent brain, why teens think, feel, and act the way they do. And if you haven't joined us before, we are at Sisu Therapies really, really passionate about neuro-affirming work. And so we really practice in a neurodiverse, affirming way. So most of you, if you have joined, would know that when we talk about neurodiversity, we're talking about any kind of, brain pattern outside the norm. So usually when we're talking about that, we're talking about autism, ADHD, there's a few other things, but I guess the takeaway as well is we will discuss a little bit about kind of what happens in our neurodiverse individuals, because there's lots of changes in the brain. And of course, our neurodiverse young people also have different patterns in their brain. So when they collide, it can be quite tricky, but we will get to that. So let's start off the adolescent lunch and learn. I will say, apologies if you're just listening, but if you are watching, I have tried to pepper through some funny memes throughout, mostly kind of that reflection on parenting, because if there's another thing that's really important when we're working with adolescents or parenting them, a good sense of humor and a shared understanding of the struggles is really important. So I've tried to keep them in. Hopefully that makes it interesting. But yeah, sorry if you're listening because you miss out on all my hilarity. But today we will be discussing things like the adolescent brain, the emotional reward and risk pathway, why that social kind of peer influence is so important in adolescence. We will be discussing neurodiversity, decision making, and then we will talk about strategies, because let's face it, if you go to a PD, you want them to tell you all the good stuff at the end with strategies. So I've done my best to include that. So no surprise here. Adolescence is a time of dramatic change in the brain. So it varies because we know that the onset of puberty can vary wildly. So usually we're talking about 11 to 25. Now that is a huge gap. And I suppose you're thinking, oh my gosh, is it from 11 till 25? I have to deal with this. No, not quite. It does go through stages. So obviously the stage when they're just at the start of puberty is very different to when you're kind of in your early 20s and sort of kind of solidifying a few of those things. So I promise you, it is not a roller coaster the whole time. Just lots of loops in between. But we will hopefully give you some information to navigate all that trickiness. So it is really, really messy up there in the brain. And that is because there are so many changes going on. So what is actually happening in the brain? Now, I will do my best to, again, explain the neuroanatomy. And I might have to flick back to me so I can show you my beautiful hand picture of the brain. Now, if you have ever seen, oh, here we go. No, that hasn't worked. See how many times I call Danny. If you have, oh, sorry, here we go. There we go. Hey! If you ever have wanted to learn a little bit about the brain, there is a lovely neurobiologist. I'm sure he has a neuro fancy doctor name, but Dan Siegel is the go-to around all things neuro, but also breaking it down into ways that parents can understand. I think that's what I really like about Dan Siegel's work, is that he has this ability to explain the brain in a way that is more accessible for parents. And one of the things which you may have seen is Dan Siegel talk about the hand model of the brain. So if you've ever seen someone do this about the brain, that's where it comes from. And this YouTube clip, all you have to do is look up Dan Siegel, hand model of the brain, and you will get a much better explanation. But at least for today, we're going to just use this really, really quickly to explain a little bit about the brain so you know what I'm talking about. So imagine this is my brain, probably about the correct size. So basically, this is facing the same way. So this front part of my hand, I've made a little fist, is the frontal cortex. Imagine this is my spine all the way down back here. And so essentially, this is kind of good because this gives us, at least for today, the three general parts that we're going to be talking about. So down the bottom here, bottom of my palm, is your brainstem, essentially our fight, flight, freeze type part of the brain. Sometimes they call it the reptilian brain, caveman brain, very primitive, basic part of the brain there. The next layer we have is, if we fold our thumb over to our palm, this is our limbic system. So I'm probably going to refer to it as the emotional part of our brain. And then wrapping over the top, put our fingers, this is our prefrontal cortex, our thinking brain, right here at the front. So this is responsible for all those executive functions we talk about: memory, concentration, attention, planning, all that really higher order stuff. So sometimes the analogy I give is, because as you can kind of guess, this is how our brain develops. So we've got babies, all they can kind of do is respond to the stimulus environment. Then they become toddlers and that emotional brain is really kicking off. And then sort of as we move to kind of that upper primary school age, that's when we start kind of developing this area. And we're talking about this in terms of healthy brain development. But this is going to be really important because when we are talking about the adolescent brain, the thing to remember is that, from baby to toddler to early childhood, we've had this really kind of nice laddered approach to the brain. And all of a sudden we enter adolescence and everything gets thrown upside down. And basically this emotional part of the brain starts to take over again. And we still do have access to this prefrontal cortex, but not all the time. There's lots of things going on in the brain. And essentially, just like when you renovate a house, we know it's going to be fantastic at the end, but my gosh, it's messy in between, lots of renovations, and we can't access those parts of our brain when we're renovating. And so if you think about it, that's what happens with adolescents. We'll talk more about it, but they're emotional, they're kind of erratic, and sometimes adolescents don't like when I talk about this, but if you scan the brain of a toddler and you scan the brain of an adolescent, you'll often see a lot of similarities in the areas it, lights up. And if you're a parent of a teenager, you're probably like, oh my gosh, yes, it is like having a toddler, but a really big toddler that also wants to push boundaries. And that's because what we're talking about is lots of brain development in that area. So just like a toddler, you have to pick your battle sometimes with the teenagers. But again, we'll get to all of that. So yeah, really, really tricky in terms of developing the brain. And kind of, I guess, if you're thinking about it, when that emotional part is going, the thinking part is off. So that's also really important to consider. And if I flick back to my beautiful PowerPoint, which I can definitely do because I've already done it. Can we? Yay! There we go. It's all an adventure. If we flick back to this, we can present it in full screen. There we go. Okay. So as you can imagine, little toddlers, Adolescence, lots of things happening. So we sort of talk about these two major processes. So essentially, as we're growing and developing, we're creating lots of connections in our brain. So we're building all these beautiful connections. We're learning. There is so much stuff in the brain. And as we develop, we need to prioritize certain things in the brain. We know we don't always need all that information. And so we have this process, which is gray matter pruning. So that's removing all your unused connections. So this is really when you kind of use it or lose it. The brain is like, okay, we've got all this stuff. We've kind of learnt about the world. Let's get rid of what we don't need so we can prioritize these other pathways. And so essentially that's kind of the flip side, is that while we're pruning, we're also myelinating. So without going into too much neurobiology, as much as I love it, myelination is almost like, the way they describe it is like the casing on wires, that nice kind of insulation that helps really strengthen those pathways. And so all of a sudden, you've got so much activity in the brain. And again, think of when NHS is out there doing electrical work, things have to go online so we can improve them. And really that's what we're talking about. So it's closed for renovation. So it is a great final product you get, but my goodness, getting there is the tricky part. So again, I guess one of the takeaways I want to give is, yes, I mean, we can all laugh about teenagers kind of being a bit toddlers, but also I think it's really important that with that knowledge, we grant them some grace. This is a biological, physiological process. We can't avoid it. They can't help it. So we've all been through it. And so essentially, when we're talking about teenagers, realistically, we have to think about what they can and can't do. Whilst teenagers are moving towards adolescence, they're not actually adults yet. And again, I know they want lots of responsibility and to be adults, but from a neurobiological point of view, they don't have that cognitive structure, and they are getting there, and we need to give them opportunities to grow. However, we also need to grant them the grace that they can't help kind of some things that are going on in their brain. We can guide them, we can help strengthen those neural pathways, we can help guide them to becoming great functional adults, but we also have to remember that sometimes their brains are going to be a little bit offline. So, as I was mentioning, it is this huge gap, and it's really talking about these waves of maturity. So it's not one age that we see these, pockets of development. Again, we've sort of seen this in early childhood. You'll often know when your child is going through a growth spurt that their behavior might become a little bit ratty. They might be eating a lot. Their sleep goes out the window. Great, this is younger kids too. Think about it in adolescence. And they're just kind of a little bit sorts. And quite often you'll kind of see this and you're like, oh my gosh, what's going on for them? And then they'll have this huge growth spurt and you go, it was a growth spurt. And essentially it's the same for our lovely adolescents. So when we're going through these patches, we're looking at sort of our reasoning in early teens, reward sensitivity from sort of 14 to 16, emotional regulation. Now, this is really important. That's in your early 20s. Impulse control, again, really important, is your mid kind of 20s. Again, you have to remember this is different for everybody. Obviously, these are huge generalization, but your identity development is kind of ongoing. So again, it's really important to consider this information when we're asking our teenagers to do things. It's important that we kind of understand what they can and they can't do and give them that grace, as hard as that is. So one of the things we know with teenagers is their reward sensitivity and dopamine. So there are things that the teens are super reactive to. And I'll play a clip in a second, but essentially this is because the brain is going through those processes. It's like, okay, what do I respond to? How does this all work? So they're super reactive to praise, novelty, peer attention, food rewards. That's amazing. And achievements. So really, when the brain is developing, it's looking for that stuff. It's seeking it out. It's like, oh yes, give me more of that. It really builds those strong memory links. So really, novelty is that teen dopamine engine. They love novel experiences. It's a nice big reward. The jumping and honey. I know that sounds ridiculous. It was like a YouTube, I don't know, one of those trend things. I was like, okay, I'll leave that there. Really, it's what we want to do is this exploration is really good. It drives the resilience and creativity. And again, if we're talking about the brain and we're thinking about what the sole purpose of the brain is, this is really, take away everything. The brain's main job at the end of the day and what it will always prioritize is survival of the species. And that's why when I showed you that hand model of the brain, the first thing to develop and the thing that it will always prioritize is that kind of caveman brain. It wants us as a species to survive. And what that means is that, again, thinking about the life cycle, baby, we need to kind of trigger our caregivers to help us get through that really vulnerable stage. Toddlers, we're kind of learning a little bit, it's huge growth development. When we're a kid, we're just absorbing everything. And then as a teenager, we're starting to move towards independence. So again, thinking about this from sort of, I guess, a more primitive societal kind of thinking, this is when you're starting to move away from your parents. So you want to explore. Our brain wants the species to go out there and find things and explore and become independent. And so that's why it's really prioritizing that from a purely biological evolutionary point of view. And it'll come up again later in this presentation, but that's also why peer relationships are so important. The brain will prioritize that. And again, if we're looking from a purely evolutionary kind of point of view, if you are not in a little group, you are less likely to survive. So we want to be accepted. And the brain will naturally make us anxious if we're not kind of getting those social connections. So again, if you think about, we were living in little caves and we are nice and safe in a group in the cave. If we're cast out, all of a sudden we're all alone in the wilderness and we're really a target. So for teenagers, as they move towards this awareness and independence, they are going to really like to explore, but also prioritize social relationships. So, as I mentioned, I've got a beautiful video clip from the lovely Dan Siegel. If I can get it to work, we will see. Oh, look at that. Let's see if it works. This is always the fun part with tech. So I've just taken a clip from this. This video is really, really good if you want to kind of listen to him talk about the brain, but I will just play this clip if it works.
It's a necessary period of development to allow the adolescent to get ready to leave home. Now, part of that is to increase the ability of this adolescent to move toward what's unfamiliar, what's uncertain, what can be uncomfortable, and even what can be unsafe. This natural drive to experience the unfamiliar, the uncertain, the uncomfortable, and the unsafe requires that nature change certain circuits in the brain. And some of those circuits that we've discovered in recent times are the reward circuitry of the brain, which drops the baseline dopamine level and increases release levels. And what that does is it makes an adolescent prone to not only feeling out of sorts and bored with just the status quo, but the release of dopamine is in a large part governed by novelty, doing something new, both with what you're thinking about and what you're doing with your body and how you're interacting with other people. So this dopamine change explains how nature tries to get the adolescent out of the house. But another way that nature has done this is something called hyper-rational thinking. And with hyper-rational thinking, what happens is the natural appraisal of the pros and cons of a decision are weighted in favor of the exciting parts of doing something. And though an adolescent knows about danger, then there's a decreased emphasis on the significance of the downside of a choice. When you combine hyper-rational skewing of the balance in favor of the exciting things of a choice, and you add that to the dopamine changes of the reward system, you can see why adolescents are taking risky behaviors and endangering themselves, not just because of impulsivity, which is true in the beginning of the teenage years, but actually going well into adolescence. And adolescence lasts into the mid-20s. This remodeling period helps us see that adolescence does not end when the 20th birthday happens and the teen years are over. So that's another myth. We've debunked the myth then that adolescence and teenage years are the same. Adolescence is not a period of immaturity. It's a necessary phase of life to change the structure of the brain. We've learned that adolescence is not just a time where impulsivity is leading to danger, but it's hyper-rational thinking and dopamine changes. And another myth we need to debunk is the idea that adolescence is a time when you are just driven mad by raging hormones. Instead, this remodeling of the brain is what's changing. The relationship between emotional spark and social engagement and novelty and creative exploration and these changes in the brain is very profound. For emotional spark, we see that the adolescent brain is literally filled with more emotional processes emerging from the body, the lower areas of the brain, including the brain stem and the limbic area, as these emotional processes move upward into the cortex where reasoning happens. So an emotional spark has a downside. You can feel moody, irritable, not be able to trust your own emotional state. The upside is life is on fire and you're filled with passion during this period. Social engagement is very important, especially when we look to compassion and empathy, in that adolescents are driven to push away from their parents, not totally, but to push away from them for sure, and to move toward their peers. This is a natural way where even in other mammalian species, we see that there is safety in association.
Alrighty, so I'm just going to pause it there. Like I said, that is a great clip. So definitely if you would like, it's not too long, it's sort of 13 minutes, but kind of solidifying there what I was sort of talking about. Hopefully that gave you a little bit more of an idea. And I included that clip because I think it's really important that we also kind of understand that risky behavior, especially you think about it in a social setting. You've got those two parts of the brain almost working against the adolescents, like the emotion, the social, I want to fit in, and then also that inability to kind of, I guess, make really sound kind of decisions. That sounds terrible. But again, we have to think about it. It's really important that we understand that adolescence is driven towards these things. So one of the things that I want to talk about as well, I guess I want to highlight rather, is safe failure. And it's something we do very much. If you've been into our office, you know we have a really big, beautiful swing set. And one of the things we talk to parents about is like failing safely. So sometimes the kids will be moving their body and jumping around, and the parents are like, oh, be careful, watch out. And particularly when it comes to neurodivergent individuals and young people, sometimes because it's really hard for them to plan and see through the consequences, even if you're telling them that, and again, think of adolescence and what they can and can't do, if you're telling them that, it's not the same as them experiencing it. So we allow young people, so if we're thinking about that swing set, to kind of, understand their bodies. And if they do something silly, obviously we're not going to let them really hurt themselves. But if I can see, maybe I'm like, oh, if you do that, you might get a carpet burn. And then they get a carpet burn. They're like, oh, okay. But they've just got feedback from their body that, oh, if I do this, or if I do this too quickly, this is going to happen. And it's one of those things like I can tell you, but if you do, the learning is so much greater. So really, it's important in a therapeutic sense that we allow these kids to have these really safe experiences of kind of failure because again, if you're thinking about it, like, often we talk about like helicopter parents or wrapping up in cotton wool, you're not actually teaching them. So even if logically and cognitively we know these things, it's not until we kind of do them and experience for ourselves that we're like, oh, okay, I actually really get it. This is a concept I understand. Now, the flip side of that is, of course, like I said, we're not going to let young people really hurt themselves in clinic, obviously. So if I'm jumping in, and I try not to jump in, but if I am, I often talk to adolescents about, I often talk to the kids about that. I'm like, oh, I can see you're doing this. I'm really anxious. I'm really worried about, I'm just going to put this under you, or, oh, you can't do that. That's unsafe. It's very rare that we'll kind of do it, but obviously I don't want young people to really hurt themselves. So I'm jumping in and going, actually, I'm going to put that boundary in that you can't do that because I'm worried this will happen. And sometimes kids are like, no, I'm really good at this. I'm like, okay, I understand that. However, I have a responsibility to you to keep you safe. So in this office, that's what we're going to do. Same thing with adolescents. And again, because they don't always have the brain structure, they might push back on them and go, oh, you're just doing this to me, you're just doing that. You have to balance as a parent, and this is hard, that allowing them to make safe choices that may have consequences. If you don't do this, this is going to happen. Versus, I guess, having to step and be like, no, that's unsafe. I'm actually going to teach you that. And that's really important that we do that. So again, having teenagers experience some safe consequences is really important for learning. So you'll notice that I use the word consequences and not punishment. And this is really important again. And this is actually something that can be used, throughout the life cycle, is when you can give a consequence over a punishment, the learning is much greater. So quite often, the really classic example I use with younger children is like that no hat, no play type scenario. If a young person loses their hat, you don't have to run out and get them another one. It's like the consequence for losing your hat is you might have to not be able to play for a couple of days, so you can go to the uniform shop. And it's like, oh, okay, if I don't take care of my hat, I'm going to have this really annoying consequence where I can't play. And again, we have to factor in neurodivergence because, things like memory and planning and problem solving, it's a little bit harder. So you might have to support them in remembering their hat. Like, okay, can we give you a clip? How do we do this? Can we talk to your teacher about, reminding you? It kind of looks a little bit different, but essentially what you're doing is structuring the intervention. Now, you're not punishing them. You're like, right, well, you're never getting a hat again, and the rest of the year you can go without it. That's kind of not reasonable, because they're kids, this stuff happens. Sometimes accidentally kids take other kids' hats. That's talk them through what's happened and find a solution. But it's a consequence. Same thing with teenagers. Let's say, particularly it's like, oh, okay, do you want me to help you, manage, when your assignments are due? And they're like, no, it's fine. It's like, okay, well, the consequence might be that you miss things and then you can't go out because you have to finish an assessment. And that's a consequence, not a punishment. Punishment would be, I'm trying to think, because even if you sort of restrict things, till they achieve this, that's kind of makes sense as a consequence. I guess a punishment would be like, no, you have to, you're grounded for this amount of time and you're grounded until the holidays are over, kind of thing. And again, it definitely depends on what's happened and the severity. But the thing to remember is then you're becoming like the bad guy and you're shutting down that learning. It's like, oh, mum's doing this, or dad's doing this. So it's a balance, and definitely depends on the young person, what strategies you've got in place, what they've done, all that kind of stuff. It's not a hard and fast rule, which makes this even more difficult. But the thing I would really emphasize is where you can, a natural consequence is really helpful. And the other thing we can think about, I guess, is you can still empathize and have a boundary. Be like, oh, yeah, far out. Like losing your hat's awful, isn't it? I completely get that you don't want to play. You can't play with your friends and you're disappointed. I can't get to the uniform shop until Wednesday. So that means tomorrow you're gonna have to play with cat. Yep, no, I know. Oh, okay. Yeah, I can see how upset you are. Maybe we can think of some strategies together that might help. That's obviously very, very generic example. The thing I will just add to the end of that is if we're thinking about the brain and we're thinking about that really emotional part of the brain taking over and the thinking part of the brain not being online, until a young person is regulated, doesn't matter what age, you will not be able to go to that problem solving. Same thing we know, even as adults, there's nothing worse than when you're having a really bad time, you're having all these emotions, and someone, even very lovingly, comes in with the solutions. You're like, I'm not ready for solutions. I just want to vent. A lot of us have had that experience, so we know what that's like. So it's the same with our young people. We have to remember what we wouldn't expect for an adult, we certainly cannot expect for our young people. And until they are regulated, they just do not have the cognitive capacity to think through solutions. So yes, they're going to be particularly upset, particularly when there's a consequence. That is not the time to be like, well, I did tell you so. Look, we've all been there. But it is that you will, once they're calm, you can talk through things. It's very tricky when you've got teenagers where that thinking part is offline a lot. 100% that is difficult. You know, parents are like, well, that's great, Hannah, but they're always moody. And I'm like, yeah, okay, no, I get it. But I guess it's still really important because, again, purely when we're looking at biology, you're setting yourself up to fail if you're not kind of thinking about it. So the other kind of little strategy I would add on is there a time of day where your adolescents or your young person, it doesn't matter how old they are, is there a good time where you know they're more regulated? For example, adolescents, because of all the changes in the brain and their sleep, sometimes they're a bit moody in the morning. Not the best time to have that conversation. However, if you guys have a good ride to school, if that's time when they've got their music on, maybe they perked up, maybe that's it. Maybe that's still not the time. Maybe after school when they're coming home, some adolescents like to chat about their day. Others are like, oh, I just need to decompress. Some families it's dinner, some when it's going to bed. It doesn't matter what time it is. Find a time when you have a greater chance of regulation and a greater chance of connection and use that to your advantage. You know, don't push something uphill when you can have an slightly easier experience and you're going to get a much greater result. Okay, so we kind of touched on the power of peer influence as well. So I won't rehash that. But again, one of the things I guess I will say is if a peer says it, doesn't matter if you as a parent or an adult have said it 6 million times, as soon as it comes from a peer, it is much more powerful. And for parents, that can be super annoying, and I get it. And even sometimes we see it in therapy where a parent will say something and then all of a sudden, not that I have much peer credit, but if it's someone who's not a parent and says, oh, what about this? They'll be like, oh, yeah, okay. And they'll take it on board. And it can be incredibly frustrating as a parent because you're like, I said that. And again, want to completely validate I've got my own child. And obviously, she is the child of a therapist. But still, when someone else says something, even if it's, you know, talking about this stuff with the brain, I've said, oh, you know, I've trotted out all this stuff before. Doesn't matter. I'm their mum. Doesn't count. So if there is a way or to introduce things from another peer or someone who's got a bit of, I'll use the Adolescent word of clout, they got a bit of like influence. This is why influencers are so important. It will be really taken on. So whilst this can be annoying, if you can use it strategically, if you've got something, that's going to be much more powerful. So as we have already touched on, that means mental health challenges are not surprisingly a big problem in adolescence. So you have a really vulnerable brain and you don't have much ability from your prefrontal cortex to problem solve and think things through. You've just essentially got your emotions driving the train really. So our emotional brain develops faster than our thinking brain, so that you know, when we're talking about the limbic system or, you know, the amygdala there, it's highly reactive. So anything that happens, it's going to be a huge reaction. And again, as parents and adults, we can be like, oh my goodness, why is this the end of the world for you? This isn't the end of the world. It kind of is from, again, if we're thinking about what's going on, you know, it is the end of the world for them because it's completely taken over and they can't think it through. Now, again, if you're a parent, as annoying as that might be, if you try and swoop in and be like, no, it's not because of this, this, and this, you're talking to a kind of a thinking brain, or like, it sounds terrible, but you're talking to that prefrontal cortex, the logical part of the brain. Your young person can't access that. You are asking them to do something they can't. They might be able to in a little bit once they're regulated, but right now, if you try and do that, you're going to get frustrated, they're going to get more frustrated and even less likely to engage in that part of the brain. And everyone's just going to feel really, really crappy by the end of it. And again, obviously, that peer kind of, you know, anxiety around social distress, social rejection, it can feel like a physical pain. They can be like, oh my gosh, no one, you know, this is huge. Again, think about it. They're not doing this to be annoying, I should use a different word, challenging on purpose. They kind of can't help it. And, you know, we were all there. We've all been teenagers amazingly. When we think back to our own adolescence, think of what that's like. Think about if you had a feeling of when you were left out. You know, even if it was an accident, even if later you're like, oh, wow, okay, actually I did my friend did text me and I didn't see it, or whatever it was, in that moment, you had that feeling, and it is really awful, and it is like that kind of physical sensation. It's huge. So what we know is that, again, that mood instability really comes up. So we do have hormones as well, which just amplifies everything. Isn't that fun? We have sleep shifts. So if you have an adolescent, you will know their sleeping patterns are terrible. That again is actually, credit where credit's due, not their fault. I mean, they don't do things to help, but their melatonin is released a lot later. I don't actually think half the time they have melatonin the way they stay up, but they stay up a lot later. And unfortunately, the world doesn't shift for their brain shifts. And so even though they can't fall asleep earlier, they still have to get up for school. And so they're super irritable. No one likes a bad night's sleep. They're very cranky. The thing I will add as well is parents are like, why do they sleep for so long? Again, thinking about when your child has a growth spurt or a development spike, their sleep firstly does go out the window, but they often need more of it. It's like if we're really busy and using our bodies a lot, we need more rest. Same with adolescents. They're using those 10, 12-hour nap sleeps, as fun as they are, because their body really needs to rest. So not always practical, but on school holidays, I'm like, look, don't let the sleep routine get completely out of whack, because gets a little bit, that's okay. But do let them sleep in where they have the capacity. It doesn't have to be every day. Yes, they still have to function in the real world, but give them some grace if you can, on weekends, whatever it is, again, within reason. So really, again, the other thing that we're talking about with adolescent brain is that identity exploration and that vulnerability to pressure. So again, we're not just thinking about peers, but how we fit into society. Who am I? What am I going to be? We really have, again, that lack of ability through no fault of their own to kind of think through things. So all of a sudden you have that catastrophizing. Oh my gosh, and sorry, I'll add by saying sometimes, again, no ill intent, but I think sometimes school kind of makes this really tricky, where my adolescents, they're in towards the end of high school, they don't know what they want to do with their lives. And, school's like, what are you going to do? You're going to uni, TAFE, trade, what are you going to do? And they're like, I don't know. I don't know what I'm good at. I don't know what I want to do. And, so-and-so is doing this. My mom wants me to do this. My friend's doing this. I don't know. And it's really difficult, because when you can't think that through and all these people are pressuring you, it's really, really difficult. And what we need to do is, what I say to teenagers when they're talking to me about this is, you know what? There's all this pressure, but at the end of the day, again, it's like a safe failure. If you finish and something happens and you don't get into your pathway, or you don't know what you want to do, it's okay. The door hasn't slammed forever. Even if something happens and, not that we ever want this to happen, we prevent it, but even if there is some sort of mental health kind of episode and young people can't finish, with an 8 or what they wanted, it doesn't mean forever they're not going to get in uni. They might have to go to TAFE and do that and get their grades up, but it doesn't mean the door's slammed. It is disappointing and upsetting. I think that's important we validate that. But it's also really important, I think, that we give adolescents this message of like, yeah, okay, I don't know what I want to do. I talk to adolescents about that. I'm like, how many people do you know who've like had the same career their whole life? Does it happen? Lots of people, mature age students, study. I changed degrees. I talked to them about that. Said, I don't know what to do. You don't know all these things. So again, validating and kind of giving them those experiences where it's like, yeah, okay, this is actually not the end of the world. But talking to them about why it's not the end of the world in a really safe and validating way, being like, oh yeah, I know that this person didn't know what they wanted to do and they did this. Those experiences and conversations can be really helpful. So we know as well with that depression and anxiety. Now, this is something that can be really tricky, and is a conversation I have with lots of parents. When do you make the distinction between what is, normal adolescence, where they are a little bit more, let's say, low, they got, sometimes people go, oh, they're lazy, they got an attitude. When is it that turn, or, again, normal anxiety, when does that term become from this is kind of a normal stage in being a teenager to this is when actually we need some full intervention. And I guess the thing I would say is you actually know your young person the best. I guess I am very biased, and I think that therapy is great. Everybody should go to therapy. Everyone can learn some better strategies. So I'm always thinking, you know what? If you're worried, it's much better to find some kind of, low, well, I say low level, but some counseling, maybe the guidance officer, something early intervention. Because if you catch it early and you get some strategies, it's much easier to manage than if it goes and we start building up some of those pathways for the teen and it's building and they don't have strategies and all of a sudden it's crisis. If you can get in early where you can, you're going to help everybody out. Now, again, it's a balance, but I think what I would say is look for signs of things that are kind of out of the ordinary. So really when, depression, there's like loss of interest, hopelessness, irritability, beyond kind of, I guess, what you would consider is normal. It's okay to give them a bit of grace, but also it's also okay to seek mental health early. When things, I guess the other thing I say with mental health is it is a problem when it stops you doing things that you love and are important to you. So for example, adolescents, sometimes they're not great at showering, which is horrible because they stink. I love my adolescents, but sometimes I'm like, maybe we just put some deodorant on. It happens. That's kind of something that they go through. Their body's changing. They can't smell it. It's painful. But there is a difference between them forgetting or kind of just, like, oh yeah, whatever, versus a young person who's can't find the motivation to shower for days and is in bed and kind of it's really hard because it looks different for everyone. But again, it's like if they're withdrawing from school, if they're withdrawing from their friends, any of that kind of real barrier to engagement, when you start seeing that, that's when I'm going, okay, it has moved from being something that is, not great, we can kind of support them, to it is actually becoming a mental health concern. And that's sort of what I often say to parents. And if you're unsure, it is much better to flag it with them. And again, you can have these conversations with your young people. Like being a parent, you don't always get the most engagement. You can be like, oh, I've noticed there's still no. But you can also be like, hey, I have noticed you have been a really hard time going to school. Is there something going on? They might go, no. No, look, it's okay if you don't want to talk to me about it. Is there someone else I can talk, you can talk to about it. You can have those conversations. But for adolescents, that being noticed is also really important. If you see something, kind of say something, as weird as that sounds, it's really validating to have someone say, hey, actually, I noticed things are really difficult for you. I don't know how schools feel about this, but I'm very pro mental health day, being like, hey, I can see you're really struggling. I've got a day off. Do you want to just hang around or do you want to go see a movie or something? And again, that might seem like a really little thing, but it's like, I've noticed something going on for you and I'm going to try and help. And you guys might go and you might not talk about anything, but you're creating that connection and that validation. One of the things, obviously, that kind of comes with that is suicide and self-harm. So it is something we know is really, really tricky, and we really need to keep an eye, keep that in mind. It's about not having the other skills and the impulsivity. And so when you're having all this and you don't have that, that's really when that trickiness can come. And you've got risky behavior, you've got teens who kind of feel like, it is the end of the world because that's what it feels like for them. And so we really need to keep our a watchful eye on this. The thing when we talk about self-harm and suicide risk, I say to parents, self-harm is not always, it's kind of, we put it in a different category from suicide risk because self-harm sometimes is more of a coping strategy. There is vulnerability and there can be like harm of kind of misadventure, but it's not necessarily a sign of like suicidal kind of ideation. They do often go hand in hand because if you're engaging in self-harm, you often feel, like things are really going badly. But, again, with self-harm or with this suicidal ideation, no shaming around it. Okay. Like it's hard because as a parent, you have this huge emotional reaction. This is your young person. You love them. But again, it's like, okay, all right, let's seek some professional help. This is where professional help comes in. It's really important to kind of do that. We want to get this stuff really sorted out and, as well as a parent, it's difficult to go through. It's really hard. And so it's important that you seek support too. I think that's the thing is, as parents, we often forget. There's that really like tried and true saying, you can't pour from an empty cup. And whilst I like that saying, because it works, I'm also really conscious that we tell that to parents, but then we don't give them the skills to help that. Like what can they do? So I think finding your self-care, especially when you got an adolescent at home, that's painful. Like, let's be real. It's hard having an emotional person, slamming doors and rolling their eyes at you. That's not always validating for yourself, and that's okay. It's okay that you're having a hard time. Two things can be true. You can understand and be empathetic of what's going on for your young person, and also think this is really awful and I need to have a break from the house. It's okay to do that, and it's okay to look after your self-care, whatever that looks at. It's okay to have a bit of a whinge. It's okay to find other parents to talk to. It's okay to laugh at silly memes about being a teenager. We connect over this. That's okay too. Looking after yourself is also really good modeling. It's like, hey, I feel really crummy about this. I'm going to have a break. I'm going to step away. It's okay that I'm just going to be by myself and read a book. It's like I feel really overwhelmed. That's good modeling. So don't be upset at yourself for doing that stuff. It's actually a nice therapeutic intervention in itself. So a little bit of Dan Siegel again. Let's get him up. Where is he? Did I put it backwards? Maybe. Let's see. All right, here we go.
Okay, so that's the first thing to say about the limbic area. Number one, emotion is more intense. And you can see this in all sorts of ways that for me were very helpful when my kids were younger. One study, for example, takes adolescents compared to kids and adults, puts them in a brain scanner, shows them a picture of an intense emotion on a face. And you see this huge emotional response in an adolescent and a mild response in a kid and a mild response in an adult. And in particular, you show a neutral face to an adolescent, and their limbic area, they're probably familiar with, the amygdala, gets all paranoid on them and thinks that the person is really having a very negative emotional response. So I came home after I read that at work one day, and I said to my kids, I said, hi. And one of them, I won't say which gender, one of them said, what? And I said, I was just saying, hi, you're doing it again. This person said. They've asked me not to talk about them, so I can talk about them in the plural, but since they're different genders, it's not easy to hide which is which. You have to be very mindful of this. Anyway, that helped me to know that their amygdala was primed to interpret a neutral hello as some kind of hostile attack. Now, I got to tell you, as a parent, that's not easy, or like all the eye rolling and all that stuff. When you reinterpret it as they're getting ready to leave home, and you don't take it so personally, it changes the whole dynamic in the family. It completely changes it. And when you're not jumping on your adolescent for what's innately happening to their nervous system that they can't help, it totally changes the whole mood in the family. Okay, so that's just.
Okay, so that's a little one. I liked that one. I kind of didn't know actually about the neutral face. I kind of knew obviously about the interpretation and stuff, but I was like, oh, that's really cool. I didn't know that. And I like Dan's, changing the whole house. I'm not sure I would go that far because, you're still being kind of like snapped at. But I think it gives us pause to think about, okay, do I need to react to this? Is this a battle that's worth it? And again, if they're really moody, they're like, why do you say that to me in that tone? You're like, I didn't, I just said this. It's really easy to get drawn into a fight. And it doesn't mean that you have to accept, like, for lack of a better word, bad behavior. It's still like, but it kind of, it helps you not get engaged in a power battle, which of course, adolescents are really pushing for that independence. Go, I wasn't doing anything. They go, yes, you were. And you're like, oh my God, it can escalate very quickly. You kind of, as a parent, sometimes have to be like, okay, look, I'm just letting you know, dinner will be ready in 5 minutes, okay? And just kind of de-escalate, but, slam the door, and you're like, that's when you use your self-care. But being like, okay, take a deep breath. I'm the adult, I'm the parent. We talk about circle of security. I'm bigger, stronger, wiser, kind. I can understand their brain is going through all this stuff. And you can talk about it when they're regularly like, hey, I've noticed when I ask about dinner's ready in 5 minutes, you kind of had this reaction. They might get sensitive again because they don't know why you bring it. What do you mean? Yeah, you talked to me like this. Oh, okay. Look, I kind of meant it like this. Is there a way that I can let you know that without you thinking, I'm yelling at you? You're gonna have that conversation. You might have to have that conversation a couple of times, and you can still put in the boundary. Hey, you can be frustrated, but it's not okay to yell at me. It's still important that you have that boundary. We're not going to let them get away with everything. That's not healthy for development. But it's about doing that with that kind of, I guess, emotional brain in mind. So we've kind of worked it out that sometimes teenagers don't think clearly in terms of what an adult thinks is clear. They think they're thinking clearly, but it's very, very different for them. So I'm going to touch on now just neurodiversity in the adolescent brain. So there is this thing I found, which is executive functions for ADHD kids. And we can kind of include this, I'm just going to say, to neurodivergence in general. But what I thought was interesting and really important is that their developmental age is 30% behind their biological age. Again, give or take, that kind of thing. But if you're looking at like a 13-year-old, they're a 9-year-old in terms of executive functions. That's really hard because neurodiversity, one of the things we see is like patchy development. So they'll be really good at one thing, but then really delayed in another. They'll often have huge strengths and then really big kind of difficulties. So it's not this kind of nice linear development. So in their executive functions, in their ability to plan and concentrate, problem solve, regulate their emotions, we can expect them to be a little bit behind. So it is going to take lots more support and empathy and validation to help. It's really difficult when someone looks a certain biological age, but developmentally has delays because you can't see that, obviously. And so particularly again when we're talking about neurodiversity, it's a hidden disability. We don't see it always. It's really hard because particularly again adolescents, they want to mask, they want to fit in, and so they will often mask. I don't need this. I don't need this support. They're pushing back on it. In reality, they might need some support. And then you kind of come up against this thing where it's like, I don't want to look different. And you're like, I know you're having these challenges. I can see it as the adult, but you can see it from your thinking, cognitive, fully developed prefrontal cortex. They are living in emotional land, okay? You're talking from your brain to kind of their limbic system. So keep that in mind. So we have to find ways. Sometimes it's sneaky therapy. It's hard. That's why therapists exist. We have to find ways to support them, and we have to do it a lot of the time on their terms. We have to help them take responsibility for their difficulties in a way that's validating. And I think normalizing part of that as well is I say, it makes sense that we have this problem. Like I have this, you might notice that mum or dad has this problem, or your teachers, it's like, it's okay to use strategies. Everyone has different strengths and difficulties. And particularly when we're looking at neurodiverse young people, because they do have these patches, yes, they will have these delays, but also they might have really great strengths. And how do we tack onto that? What is their strength? How can we manage and use strategies that utilize their strengths to help with those difficulties and giving them success? Again, think about that dopamine. We want them to be successful. If we're looking at scaffolding, I would much rather come in and give young people maybe a little bit more scaffolding, taking a step back and giving them some success and then grading. We talk about stepping that back. So sometimes parents are like, oh, they're 15, they should be able to do this for themselves. It's like, okay, well, I think they're trying. I don't think they can. Yes, we can. Their biological age is 15, but firstly, they've got a teenage brain, but also they've got some sort of, developmental difficulty. So let's not expect things. Let's jump in, let's scaffold, let's maybe make things really kind of take that pressure off, help them be regulated, help them feel that success, and then we can start to build the skill. It kind of, again, always starts with that regulation. So again, if we're thinking particularly about strategies, it's about scaffolding, making sure they're as regulated as possible, because that's really difficult. So think about sensory overload, thinking about supporting them with their sensory environment to help that regulation. I love sensory strategies because it's not a huge cognitive load. Like, you can change your environment and they're really easy to grab without having to think too much about it. We can be predictable. We can help use scripts to empower. We want to like really tap into that. Okay, you want to become an adult. How do we do this? But I think again, that takeaway, navigating adolescence is hard, and we need a balance. So I've got these pictures. I was like, oh, what do I find? So, it's hard. We have too much freedom, and what that can do if we don't give any structure around that, and too little freedom. It's hard, because if we just give kids the rein, like, yeah, go do whatever you want, they might come out fine in the end. And I think that's what I tried to sort of show with these pictures of, Lindsay Lohan and Britney Spears. We kind of saw them in the early 2000s. That was really tricky. If you just give them free rein, they don't have the prefrontal cortex to make good decisions. But if you don't give them any freedom, they also don't develop that capacity to make those good decisions, and they're going to push away and they're going to do risky behavior. It kind of, both ends of the spectrum are not setting up healthy development. And again, it's really, really hard because every young person is different and not one size fits all. And that makes it incredibly difficult. Again, if I want to validate and give you some kind of strategies, it's also, remember, when we're looking at circle of security parenting, really from an attachment point of view, you only need to get it right 30% of the time. Okay, so that good enough parenting is only 30%. You might do too much one day, you might do too little one day. It's okay as long as you are that nice, strong, stable base. You have to be that bigger and stronger. So not all the freedom, but kind and wise, thinking about when they can do that, when they do fail, giving them that regulation. And again, think back to your own teenage years. I know as the teenies say, cringe. Yep, I get it. Being a teenager is a shared experience. And we know that, it's a time of peer and social development. We see teens get really into social issues because they're learning about it and things are passionate to them, and they're developing that sense of justice. So it doesn't matter whether we're looking at the 60s and people are protesting to, the climate protests with the young people. They are interested in this stuff. It's a shared experience. We know the brain develops in these ways, and we've done this too. And you look at media and what's out there, that kind of coming of age film and TV, it's the same things. You've got identity formation, belonging, independence, that love. Oh, I don't have time to get into first relationships. Just know that breakups are hard and it does feel like the world's ending. Friendship, conflict, security, moral development. It doesn't matter. Those themes are consistent. We've got the 60s and the 90s, and then kind of like, I didn't have many examples. I felt really bad. I was like, oh gosh, what are the new people in? But, I've thrown up some few examples like, Dairy Girls, Dawson's Creek, and even looking at things like Happy Days, where they're talking about, even a very like wholesome show. They still dealt with some kind of, development and kind of what this stuff is. We've got The Breakfast Club. We've got Saved by the Bell. Again, this kind of stuff, they threw some in, Rebel Without a Cause, all this stuff, even things like Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. There was a couple of episodes there where they really dealt with that belonging and family and all this kind of stuff. These are repeated themes that we see because adolescence is a repeated experience that we all have to go through. Unfortunately, sorry. And do you know what? It's tricky because, again, it's not just about that we all go through it, but there are also different challenges. So I wouldn't be talking about the teenage brain without addressing the social media ban. It's a hard one because as a therapist, I do see that there are harmful things on social media. And, again, the dopamine scrolling, hard. We're developing brains. You know, there's social media, there's bullying, you know, there's all this stuff. There was some really briefly read it, didn't get enough into it, but things like the TikTok algorithm, if you put in you're a boy, whether you put in, you know, your gender, the content it automatically generates for boys versus girls is pretty shocking. Boys, you're already starting to see some of that gross toxic masculinity stuff immediately based on your gender versus girls, which is like, you know, makeup and well-being and all that stuff. So we have to be really aware of these kind of things. The problem that I see with just banning it is, again, you're not having that kind of like goodness me, safe failure. We're not, you know, the criticism has been really, you know, no, we're not actually telling the social media people to fix their content. They're just like, oh no, we'll just, you know, wing it when it comes to when you're 16. You're not having a safe experience because they have nothing and then they have everything and it's not regulated. Like social media hasn't had to fix this. And it's really tricky because some kids will still have it. Kids are sneaky. Kids are clever. They're all looking at the, I don't know how it works, the VPN routers. Please excuse me because I got no idea. You can tell they've already worked ways around it. They're like, okay, you know, like at what point have teenagers ever listened to some sort of ban? You know, that's kind of like it's a challenge. So then you're going to have the, oh, who can and can't get on it. And there's also been this stuff, oh, I should have written down the names of this other alternative social media. One's like, I think it's Lemonade. And then there's another one I can't remember the names of. They're like alternatives. And kids have already found it and they've skyrocketed. It's like, you know, where there's a will, there's a way. And so the problem is we're not actually teaching young people the skills. And that's what I worry about, is that when you just ban, you haven't actually taught them anything. Now, again, I hope there is some of that stuff, but if you're looking at it, it's like, oh, great, now we've got teachers that have to, you know, go in and be like, okay, kids, we're going to learn about social media. You haven't got the credit. You know, the teachers don't have that peer influence. It's like they're an authority figure, so they're not going to know. Parents aren't going to know. We've taken that experience away. And kind of, I guess, if I was being sneaky and being like, oh, how can I teach my adolescents something? I might be like, let's go on social media and see what the good influencers say. And I can't do that because I now have lost access to a bunch of their peers, essentially. And I'm not cool. You're not cool. Sorry. You know, we're just, you know, sticking it to them, and, you know, teenage can do stuff, and, you know, we've just annoyed them all. So it's really, really tricky. And I think, again, if I'm thinking about an example where I had to work with an adolescent who was engaged in some, I guess, what I'd call like that toxic masculine, like gross Andrew Tate stuff about, you know, this is what it is to be a man. You know, they're forming their identity, and he was talking to me about it, and I was like, ugh, you know, but again, I'm a cisgendered female. I'm older. So I'm coming in being like, that's gross. You know, like I only have so much power here. So what I did is I used social media and I did a bit of a deep dive and looked at people who I guess would fit the stereotype definition of like a man. And I think there's a couple. There was one I found which was called, oh, I didn't get his name. Basic dude stuff. Basically, it's a guy who like chops wood and is like an ex-Navy SEAL, and he goes basic dude stuff, and he's like fixing a fence and then like bringing flowers to your wife. And the idea is essentially this guy was like this huge burly man, and he would do all these manly things like chop wood, but then he'd also actually be like, talk about your feelings with your therapist. And again, it was like, oh, okay, if we're looking at the definition of a man, I was able to be like, okay, what can Andrew Tate do? Okay, he's got a fast car, but like, okay, whatever. This dude can like chop lumber, and I don't know, what do you think? I'm like, who's the definition of a man if this is the way you're telling me? Like, okay, well, kind of thing. And it was able for us to have a discussion about it. And, you know, again, I don't have as much clout, so I can't, you know, I have to be really aware of that. But I'm like, hey, actually, let's look at some alternative theories here. If I'd come in an election and be like, Andrew Tate is gross and horrible, which, you know, I kind of feel like, yes, it is. I would get a wall, you know, I'd be like, you don't know what you're talking about. You're not into this. You have to be curious with teenagers. Curiosity and getting them to talk about things and have that discussion, you will get a better traction because you're not telling them what to do. You're not hitting that wall. You show you're genuinely understanding, and you will learn specifically what it is they're tacking onto. And that's really important when we're talking about like, these experiences. We have to have conversations, and you have to listen to them genuinely. You can't just argue, because teenagers love a good argument. I wish they did it. But let's get on to practical strategies. I know I've been talking for a long time, but I do actually feel like, adolescence is hard. Let's give you as much as you can. So practical strategies for teens. We've talked a lot about these. So they have physiological needs. So I wish I didn't write the acronym down, which was very silly, but it's like, are they hungry? Are they thirsty? Are they sleepy? Yes, it's like a toddler. But also, if you're hungry, thirsty, or sleepy, you are not usually a pleasant person. So why would your teenager be different? They need a lot of food and sleep. Make sure that they are not hungry or sleepy, because then people are cranky. Um, Attachment needs. So regulation is above everything, so important. If your child is not regulated and doesn't have a safe base, you're already fighting a losing battle. You need to make sure they're regulated and attached and doing things. I think it's really important to try and meet teens with their interests. Again, I understand that, it's not always cool for you to engage in the interests, and yeah, I get it, but you can still try and engage them with where they're at and try and find things where you can connect. It doesn't matter what it is, but it's like, hey, I've noticed you're into this. I really want to learn about it. And you might have to try a few different things, but it's like, oh, okay. It's like, oh, you want to see this movie? That's, like if they're like, oh, super into Wicked, you're like, I don't want to see Wicked. It's like, okay, well, you might just have to take the bullet and take them to Wicked. And okay, they might be going with their friends, but maybe they'll want to see it again with you. Try and find those things where you can connect and build that attachment, because it means that when you need to do correction or learning, you've got a good base to start off with. Regulate, then communicate. So, I've already talked about this. Can't talk to an emotional brain. It doesn't work. And I think, again, I've talked about the open communication. So avoid that interrogation. You're going to shut them down if you're just bombarding them or harassing them. Again, context. It's like my favorite thing here. I'm like, I get it. I'm a parent. You want to go in and get information. But if you're curious, be like, oh, okay, I wonder what's happening. Oh, all right. So is this? And, giving them the chance to explain themselves. Don't give them any ammo for that. You never listen to me, or you just assume this. Kind of meet them where they're at. If they are saying stuff, you're like, oh, okay, sorry, what makes you say that? Oh, right, when I do this, you don't feel like you have a time to explain. Well, if I just pause and let you talk about it, can I then have my turn to respond? Or can I check my be like, okay, can I check my understanding? It's like, I hear you're saying this. I'm thinking this is what you mean. Is that right? And that's just a good communication strategy. It doesn't matter what it is. That's good. Oh, my little I was trying to do this for a podcast, and it got angry because I've obviously talked too much. I don't know how much I'm talking, but my phone's like having a little meltdown. It's a lot. I completely. That's all right. Let's continue. Done. Yeah, it's tough. It's tough. You want your kids to get up, and you feel like I'm sitting here telling you, you need to listen to your teenagers and validate. And then you've got this classic, like, get up, please get up now, get up, why? Oh, and then you're like, I'm not young. It's 100%. It's okay. It's okay to be frustrated, and it's okay to only get it right. So practical again, we've talked about consequences over punishment. We've talked about open and honest communication, and conversations. It's okay. Teens are learning. That they learn from you and not the internet, because the internet's not great. It's have those awkward conversations as much as you like. It'll be gross. You kind of have to, because you're like, yeah, look, I get this is uncomfortable, but I don't want you learning these things from the internet. It's hard. It's okay to have those conversations. Being consistent, so hard, especially if we're looking at having two parents, whether you're in the same house or separate. Teenagers are smart and strategic. If there is inconsistency, or if they learn how they can weasel in something, they will go for it. Kids are intelligent. Now, that's really hard. I understand if you have different parenting styles, or let's say you're in different houses. I want to, again, just take time to validate that you might, be listening to this and going, oh, yeah, I can do all this stuff, but the other half might not. it's really difficult. I think that that is one of the most difficult things to navigate with shared or co-parenting, is that one parent might be bringing me their young person and doing stuff, but then they'll go to the other parent's house and it'll be undermined. And that's really difficult. And I think that's a much longer conversation. What I will say again is, at the end of the day, you won't be able to control everything. You can't control brain development, and you can't control everyone else's environments and the environments they're in. What you can do at the end of the day is be a safe, secure base. You can be the consistency within yourself. You can be like, this is always as you. Again, it's like any sort of parenting. It's like, I love you. I'm not really in love with your behaviors, but I love you as a person. And I think that's a really important message, not just for all kids, but really when you're looking at a teenager, it's like you can be making bad choices and you can be doing these things. And that's really not what I want. But I still love you as a person. You will always have a safe home here. I will love you. I would much rather you come and talk to me about these things. There's times when you're like, I really want to judge you, but I really also want you to talk to me. It's difficult. It's, again, you can be empathetic and you can be here. But I guess, again, when you're looking at strategies, prioritizing that regulation, you need to be, as much as you can, a safe, consistent base. And pick your battles. Let's face it. We've only got so much time and energy. Save it for the ones you need. The thing that I kind of didn't put on there, which has just sort of popped into my head as well, is that having teenagers with your own parenting journey, there can be triggers. There can be, it doesn't matter what stage, everyone's gone through their own life and development and experiences. So if you feel like something is coming up for you, or if you're feeling there's triggers or something is making you vulnerable, it's again really important that you seek your own help around that. There are lots of triggers around teenage years. We're talking about mental health for the teens, but you were also a teenager and you also had these experiences, and you also might have had some vulnerable mental health concerns, again, because your brain was developing. So give yourself some grace and make sure you're seeking your own help. If there is something that's triggering you, you are responding from an emotional brain. And that is so difficult because maybe your prefrontal cortex is offline. So, as we would with a young person, when things are getting too much, it's really important you seek your own therapy. And again, you can model that with a teenager. You can be like, yeah, actually, I've got some stuff coming up for me, or, whatever is appropriate to share. I'm going to go talk to somebody because it's really important that I talk through my feelings. You might be like, oh, look, I just want to get some extra strategies. I just want to, talk out my day. Modeling is hugely important. And again, sometimes it's really hard because we'll be doing these parenting things and we might not be getting the feedback in real time. Like kids might be like, oh, this is their favorite one, ugh, or whatever, or like, brah. But it's also like they're still learning. They're little sponges. Their little brains are absorbing. So even if you don't get feedback in the moment and you feel like you're just doing all the right things and it's not going anywhere, I can assure you it is going in. You are helping development. It's painful when you're not getting feedback, but again, maybe that's when you go, I'm doing this, and to one of us or a therapist, and we say, you're doing so well. Get that validation from someone else because you are doing great. And there is this thing that I like to talk about with parenting. And it's like, if you're worried about you being a good parent, or, if you're Googling, am I a good parent? You're already a good parent because you are conscious of it and you're doing things to actively work on your parenting and think about it. So please, if you're worried about it, seek your own validation, but also take away this validation that you're listening to this, you care, you're learning, you're doing a great job. It is hard. So I guess I kind of put that in. You can't control the wind, but you can adjust the sails as much as you can in the storm. Sometimes it's like, put on your life jacket. You've got these changes, and they're neurological, they're biological. You went through it, they're going through it. You are going to have things that make your life easier and harder. And when you're dealing with a hard period of time, try and do the things that are going to make your life easier, both now and in the long term. And it's tough, seek support. So remember, you're doing great. It's hard. And I guess I'm going to finish up there because I know I've spoken over the hour, but yeah, so much content. And when I don't have to do it in front of a live audience, I chuck in extra stuff, which is maybe good or bad. Thank you if you stayed to the end. I know I like to yap, but that brings us to the end. As always, if you have any questions, please reach out. We've got my email there. You can go to the website, have a look. You can go back and replay this if you really are keen to hear my voice again. You know, goodness help you. But please flick through. We are always happy to answer any questions that you have. We understand that people can't always watch this content immediately. So even if you're watching something else, you're like, oh, actually, I don't understand that. Give us a call, send us an email. We love helping people learn. Obviously, we do this because we love it and we want to support people in their learning journey. Also, it's the last Lunch and Learn of the year, and we are not doing one in January because that's so early in the year, and I think my team might not. I think we're having our planning day technically on that Tuesday. So there won't be a Lunch and Learn for January, goodness me, but we are already planning the rest of the year. We're looking at doing PDA, which is pathological demand avoidance. That's a really big one. I might be doing another one on kind of trauma and disrupted attachment because that's something I get requests for a lot. But please reach out. We want to make these as relevant as possible. So have a look through what's already up there. And if you feel like we need to go back and do another series on something, if you want us to rehash anything, we really want these to be responsive to the community. So it doesn't matter what the topic is, big or small, please let us know because if you're thinking about it, likely someone else is. And yeah, we love ideas, so we don't have to keep thinking of our own. We want to be helping everybody. But again, thank you for coming along. I don't know how to escape from this, but once again, I hope that any of this helps you with your adolescence and, remember you're doing great. And if I can help at all, we are more than willing. Have a wonderful rest of the day.